Hey, you awesome folks! Thanks for taking this journey of discovery with your guide, Keith Haney. You're listening to the Becoming Bridge Builders podcast, your favorite podcast for everything from racial reconciliation to education innovation, justice reform, and leading change in the 21st century. This podcast is for people who love to be challenged with difficult topics, but want practical solutions to solve these challenging issues. Becoming Bridge Builders makes change possible. Each week on the podcast, Keith invites innovative thought leaders to share how they are building bridges in their area of expertise. You will hear breakthrough ideas and concepts that are changing the world. He's featuring guests who are best-selling authors, leaders at Microsoft, entrepreneurs, leading educators, professors, lawyers, and so many more. Listen in to learn how you can be the bridge to the change you are seeking.
Well, Andrew, welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Keith. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
You say that now. We haven't got into the conversation.
True. But hey, what could go wrong?
No, that's true. It's very true. So I'm going to ask you my favorite question. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
The best piece of advice I've ever received. I don't know if it's advice, but I used to be a professional chef, and I think some of my lessons from there have been the most transformative, even though I've worked in churches and worked in Christian organizations. But there was one time I was cooking in Park City, Utah, big ski resort area. Sundance Film Festival happens there, but I was lead line cook. So I was running the line, and it was a busy winter day, and we were just slammed, and you've seen probably videos of it where like the ticket, are just across the board and nobody knows what's going on. And we had like a little pass, that was probably like a foot high where we would put the plates, there's warmers. And the executive chef at the time, Carter, he's like, Andrew, look at me. And I'm like, I don't have time. I'm like, and he's like, no, stop what you're doing. Look at me. Like, and, he's like, doing the eye contact thing. And he's like, take a deep breath. You got this. Like, and that settled me. Like, it helped me refocus. It allowed me just to be like, okay, like I got this. Like, and then from there, I was able to gather my thoughts, get the team organized. And from there, we were able to knock it out, And so I think it was the lesson of like, okay, when chaos is swirling, there, and you don't feel like you can take a breath, stopping and collecting yourself is probably actually the best thing you can do, just to slow yourself down, recenter, regather, and then move forward.
You just recalled my post-college career for a little bit. I was a line cook in a Mexican restaurant, and I was actually hired to actually work on the dishes. And they're like, "Oh, you look too smart to be on the dishes, so we'll put you on the line." And I remember we used to get like $10,000 hours. So those lines of tickets you're talking about,
yeah.
And we had, because it was a Mexican restaurant, but it was kind of a high scale. We had a grill part. There was the typical Mexican dish parts. We have sometimes steak and enchiladas and all that. And we were running plates through, and I remember just the total chaos of that, and trying to get people who were, new to this, and me being new to it, trying to figure out what a F-18, F-8 was, and F-13s, and this.
Yeah.
So yeah, that whole total chaos. Thanks for that flashback. I'm not real sure I can sleep tonight. Thanks for that.
Hey, you're welcome. I still sometimes, if I'm at a restaurant and I hear that ticket machine, the ticket clicker, I still have some post-traumatic stress syndrome. It's sort of just like
right. It's just like you get a twitch. It's like you can't, nervous tick you can't get rid of.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Andrew, who are some people, as you think about your life, who served as a mentor for you, or maybe an inspiration on your journey?
There's people that have stood out. The list is probably too long, Um, but the ones that stand out, I had a high school youth group leader in church, Ryan Takanaga. He was it was a big church. Our youth group was probably 400 to 500 big. And so we were divided into smaller groups, and Ryan was our small group leader. And he was doing his master's in philosophy at Talbot Seminary. This was we were in Orange County, California. And my small group were all the kids who had grown up in the church. We were the elders' kids, the pastor's kids, the former missionary kids, like, the goody goodies, the kids who, we got told a couple of times from the leaders, like, hey, everybody's looking to you. You need to behave. And you're like, well, thanks. That's going to help a lot as a high school. Like,
Exactly.
good old Christian guilt. But what Ryan did for us is, we just got tired of the normal high school lessons. And one summer he took us through J.P. Moreland's Scaling the Secular City apologetics book. And it was one of those first times where I felt like I could, I engaged my mind with the Christian faith in ways that I hadn't. And so Ryan played an instrumental part. After college, I lived in China for 3 years, working as a youth pastor for missionary kids. And while there, Tom Kimber served as a mentor and just really as a pastoral mentor, and just what does it mean to be a pastor in profound ways, and that whole host of missionary community. What was cool there is I got to work with like 15 different nationalities and, if not more, denominations. So everything from Assemblies of God to Dutch Reformed, and you got to see what the beauty of the Christian faith can be. Growing up white, evangelical, clapping was not, looked high upon in my church, and so like to learn from these Assemblies of God, men and women who love Jesus and want this experience of the Spirit. But then when I started cooking, Chef Gary Menez, who's in Los Angeles, he was the first one to hire me when I was in culinary school, and we still stay in touch. But he's always Chef Gary to me. Will never be will never be just Gary. He's always Chef Gary. Just like some of my Sunday school teachers are still Mr. Durbin, never Jim, even though I'm 44 now. Like, but Chef Gary, and then Carter, who was the executive chef in Park City, has really, I think those are the people that stand out to me as I think about people who have influenced me. And then authors galore. I'm a reader. I love to read. So Eugene Peterson, I'll throw in Eugene Peterson just because a man who loved Jesus, served faithfully, but was able to blend the head and the heart in ways that I don't think many can. And so Eugene has always been my aspirational model. Okay, if I can be somebody, like, how can I be more like Eugene? And yeah.
No, I love that. Didn't he had something to do with the Message Bible, didn't he?
Yeah, he translated the Message. His PhD is in ancient languages. But like some of his work on pastoral ministry, and then he wrote this 5-volume work towards the end of his life, on spiritual theology, that he said this is formed from 30 years of canoeing down the river with men and then teaching in academia. And it's just, he just had this way about him that, it's just beautiful to me.
I love that. So what inspired you to start the Biggest Table podcast?
Yeah. So you're wondering, okay, I'm a pastor, I'm a chef.
Right.
And what like people, how does this work, Andrew? Like, this isn't, you're dealing with unruly people in both instances, really broken people.
Except one group tips, the other one doesn't.
Yeah, one group tips, one group owns their dysfunction, the other group tries to hide it.
Right.
I'll let you decide which is which. And if you think it's the church people who are open about their flaunts, or open about their faults, you're wrong. Anyway, sorry. Church hurt, okay. But it actually, this actually started in China back in 2005, probably for me. It was actually reading Eugene Peterson. When I was in China, I was noticing we, as the missionary community and just in general, there was a lot of time we spent at the table. And I began to just wonder, okay, why why do we linger at the table? And in China, like we all lived in apartments, small-ish apartments, and so the dining room table is literally 5 feet from a couch. And yet after dinner, we're just still lingering in very uncomfortable chairs, happy and content. And it's not because we ate too much, we're there. And so it was sort of like, okay, why do we linger at the table? What is it about the table? What is it about food that causes us to just stay? And I'm, being an avid Eugene Peterson reader, I think my parents had sent me one of his new books, Living the Resurrection, small book, but he has this one sentence where, um, that he says the gospel writers are most fond of telling stories about Jesus around the table. And it was one of those moments that just all this sudden, it's one of those holy moly moments, like what? Oh, wait, okay, something's radical here. And that just has sent me on this journey of, okay, what is food? What does it mean to eat? How do we, prepare food well? What does it mean to be hospitable? And so since then, it's just been this journey, that led me back to seminary, led me into culinary school while going to seminary and working. Don't recommend that. But it was this way of me exploring food and spirituality and this interconnectedness. And life has taken us various ways, but there was just never a moment where I felt like I could enter into this project fully. Like I've done some blogging, tried to write done some book reviews. But back in July of 23, lost my job here in Flagstaff as a pastor. And in the midst of the grief, in the midst of the pain of that, and, and me and my family trying to figure out what's next, it was sort of like, well, I have the time now to enter into this project. I've always wanted to do it. Why not start? And I thought, okay, I love to read. I love to interact with guests and authors. Like, why not start a podcast as an easy way just to have some fun conversations and see who might be interested? And so it just sort of started from there. And, I've never been shy about reaching out to authors I love and their books, and because I said, figured, well, the worst they'll do is just not respond, like, and so I'm like, the answer is always no until I ask. And so I just started reaching out to authors and people I like and books I've read from on the intersection of food and faith and or just, hospitality. And all of a sudden people started saying yes. And you're like, wait, what? I get to have a conversation with you? Like, and so, yeah, it just has turned in this way for me to expand my horizons, you know, refine what I think and believe, but also hopefully help others to think through what is the table, what does it mean to eat, what are, how does racism and injustice play into our food ways? How does, the hurt, the pain, the brokenness wreak havoc on food systems, but then also how can healing be brought about through the table? And so, yeah, it's been fun, doing a podcast. People think it's probably easy. I think we all have these grand illusions that we'll be the next like Travis Kelce or the Kelsey brothers and be making millions, but it's slow progress. But it's also, if I just think about it, of the conversations I get to have and how it's helping me think through what does it mean to be faithful in this age, then it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, we all think we're going to be the Joe Rogan of the Christian Faith podcast.
Yeah, no.
Haven't reached 1 million yet, so I still have a long way to go.
Yeah, yep, yeah.
When you talk about the idea of food and faith, I remember one time when I was filling in at the chapel during Easter, and I was trying to figure out, what Easter text could I preach on? Because you always have the ones that you always preach on, but I wanted something different. So the Old Testament lesson was from Isaiah, where God talks about this banquet that he lays before us, describing heaven. But as I dug deeper into that analogy, it really was more than that, because the way a conquering king would celebrate victory was he'd have a banquet. If you really wanted to kind of rub it in your opponent's face, you'd have the banquet in front of your opponent. The defeated enemy. Yeah. So there's this picture in Isaiah of God laying out this enormous banquet with the finest meats, the greatest wines, in front of Satan.
Yeah.
And it's saying to Satan, you've been defeated, and here's the banquet,
Yeah.
celebrating your defeat, and you're
Yep.
welcome to
Yeah.
come and partake of the banquet. And so
Right.
I love when you talk about this idea of tying and connecting food and faith. So how do you see in the work that you're doing now, connecting the beauty of food, the table, and faith all together to kind of communicate a message to people who may not make that connection?
Yeah. I always like, like you said, Isaiah paints this beautiful picture. But when you think about the story of Scripture, whenever God wants to communicate redemption, there's always food involved. Like, um, you know, let's, we start in the garden, and he plants us in this beautiful, luscious, abundant garden, and we make a mess of it, and the story, however we interpret it, there's eating. Um, but then from that point on, you think the Passover, it's food, it's a meal. The prophets, the Old Testament prophets communicated a lot of this messianic banquet, and that the finest wines and the best meats would be filled. And I think right before that Isaiah vision of the messianic banquet, like there's this vision, and I think it's in Isaiah 24, if I remember correctly, but like where like the streets are desolate. There's no scening. There's, the wine has dried up. People are just, the sad, you just think of desolation, and um, food is tied in with that. And then, Jesus comes, and there's a lot that Jesus does around the table, but the communion is a table, with eating, and then finally we get to Revelation, and the great marriage supper of the Lamb. Or Peter in Acts 10, he's told to eat unclean animals to be as a reminder of, no, God's kingdom is for everyone. Like, we're to welcome all. And so the story of Scripture is littered, from beginning to end, with this idea of food and this idea of communion, um, and hospitality. And so I think, if we can understand that, and understand the beauty of what the table can be, where we make a space for others and ourselves to be seen, um, to live, um, it just naturally happens, like when people enter a house, we all gravitate towards the kitchen at first, um, and we like to eat together. We like to be around a table, and so I think it's this idea that there is something that happens at a table that is mysterious, but also that we know happens because Jesus told us to eat in remembrance of him. And so I, I can never fully explain it because I think I want to leave room for mystery at point. But um, when we see the table as more than just sustenance, physical sustenance, but emotional, relational, spiritual, like sustenance, and we see that we can be there. It's beautiful, And then when you think about us as embodied creatures, you know, eating is something we have to do with all of our senses. Like it's one of the few acts that I think engages every sense we have, from touching to smelling to hearing to tasting. Like it's all there, and so we are embodied creatures. And so how does eating help us remain embodied and be present, to who we are, in both good and bad ways? So yeah, I think there's just a lot wrapped up into it. And I think taking the time to just help people see that, yes, we have to eat to survive, but there are moments where we can find a beautiful relational component and a beautiful spiritual component, as we eat.
No, you're right. Some of the greatest memories of my growing up as a young person in our church was every November we'd have this Harvest Home Festival, where
Right.
we would have this beautiful banquet laid out, and we'd invite the community, and it was this opportunity to have this deeper connection of food, fellowship, and faith, and to see that. I mean, some of those are just the best and most. We'd have block parties in Detroit and in
Yeah.
Milwaukee, where we block off the block. We'd have, you smell the hot dogs and the hamburgers grilling, and people would come. I remember we had a chili cook-off in our community in St. Louis, and we'd invite the community, and just that idea of it broke down barriers
Yeah.
and created a sense of comfort and peace and serenity as you kind of came together around a shared meal and just broke bread together. It just broke down so many walls, like you talked about earlier.
Yep. Yeah. No, and even I was talking to a guest recently, Dr. Christopher Carter, who's written on Black foodways and injustice, but he talks about, the stories our food tells. And, he taught some classes, and he'd always have his students recall to mind a food memory, a dish, and the story that's wrapped up in that, because I think if you can harken back and think through, like, you can think of a dish that, and it may have been a terrible dish, right? But like, there's probably some laughter involved, but like that you can probably still smell and feel like there's a embodied response to that memory. That, like, if we take the time to think back, of, okay, those block parties, you can probably still smell those hot dogs and those hamburgers, and think of the kids, you get a picture, and so I think these food memories carry in our bodies something that helps us um, stay connected to our history.
I love that. As you think about your podcast, are there some impactful stories or guests from the Biggest Table podcast that kind of stick out in your mind
Ooh.
without
Yeah.
hurting the members, the people who showed up on your podcast?
Yeah. No. And that's what's, like, I've always been amazed at the guests I've been able to have conversations with. But I think a lot of it, what has helped me think through, let me start again. A lot of my table is filled with joyous memories. Like, the table for me is a place of joy, celebration, stability. So I have a lot of good memories wrapped up in the table. As I've entered into this podcast, and even since I've entered into this podcast, being able to talk with some African Americans like Derek Weston, Michael Twitty, Christopher Carter, all, they're sharing memories of brokenness, of the hurt involved, from African American slave food, and the history that's tied up in that, and that sometimes the food carries with it trauma stories, and telling these stories of trauma and hurt that are needed so that we can change the story and change the narrative, and own our history and be honest. And so I think learning and seeing the brokenness in our foodways has been hugely important to me this past year, to see that how much injustice there still is, from food deserts to the need for vegetables in communities that don't have access to it. So I think that's been powerful for me and shaped me. I also love talking to Gisela, Gisela Kreglinger, who's written on the spirituality of wine. And she's wants to sort of demystify wine. The job that pays the bills right now is I'm a wine rep for a small distribution company, so I sell wine, and I'm in the language a lot, and around people who have advanced psalm degrees. But what she wants us to do is, when we sip wine, to engage with what it's doing in our bodies. What memories does it bring up? That we don't need the experts to tell us what we're smelling and tasting, that we can do it. And she uses the phrase the priesthood of all drinkers, playing on the scripture priesthood of all believers. But it's really cool because then, because we approach something like wine, or we approach something like high food, and we think, oh wait, I don't have the refined palate, I can't do this. But her idea is that, as you drink this, it's going to bring back memories. There's something that's going to smell, the flavor. There's going to be, your body's going to react to it in certain ways. And so how can we use that to then engage with Jesus? and pray, and she says every sip is a prayer, and I think it's that idea of, again, part of food asks us to be attentive to the present moment, whether it's a sip or a bite, that lasts 10 seconds or less, like that flavor is here and then it's gone. And so how do we be attentive in those split seconds, and how can that help us then be attentive to Jesus in those moments where um, we may not always be expecting it?
Oh, I love that. So you seem to have had some really interesting guests. As a podcaster, I'm always curious, how do you pick your guests for your podcast?
How do I pick? I think for me, it's always just been a book that grabs my attention, a topic. Like this fall, there was a new book by a pastor in Phoenix, Caleb Campbell, on how to love your Christian nationalist neighbor. Um, it's called Disarming Leviathan. Great book by InterVarsity. And so it was like, oh, this feels very apropos. Like, and he brings in hospitality and how do we sit at a table with people who we strongly disagree with. So, it's thinking about that, or who do I want to learn from? Who have I enjoyed engaging with that I think my guests could have, enjoy. But then also always bringing in that table aspect. So even if they're not writing about food explicitly, like how does the table then factor into their book or their ideas, and how can the table be a tool of reconciliation, or a tool of justice, or so yeah, I think it's people who strike my fancy. That's really how it comes down to.
I love that. Yeah, I do a lot of that myself. Like in February on my podcast, I've got several guests who are approaching. I don't like doing traditional Black history podcasts because that's
Yeah.
boring. But I thought what I would do is talk about topics that are involving race and racial reconciliation in our country. So I have guests on who are talking about It's Never Been Fair, talking about diversity from a Christian perspective and working in Washington. Right. So there's a lot of that kind of let's talk about the issues that we don't ever get to because we let words or language separate us. Mm. So let's not focus on what DEI is, but let's focus on how do we become an inclusive community. So I like the fact that we're kind of have some of the same crossover type topics around this. How do we begin to create an inclusive community? And even that word inclusive gets kind of taken back to all kind of other things, but just a culture where you can welcome people to the table to share a common meal or a common thought or to bring about reconciliation. Because in the end, our mission is to go back to what the Bible says, to be about sharing, be Christ's ambassadors and ambassadors of reconciliation. Yeah. How do we do that as a church if we don't want to have the conversations about the hurt that's out there? And you mentioned, being in the church. There's a lot of hurt that sometimes the church puts on and puts out there. We don't ever want to get back to how do we heal even those past things.
Right. Man, if I could solve that question, I could probably be a church consultant and
you could do wine and church consultant.
Church consultant, I know, right? Like, because it's not easy, and I think, yes, it was hurtful to be laid off from a church, but in some ways it has given me the space and the freedom to then step back from the church for the first time in a really long time and be like, okay, what is actually going on, and like what corrective actions might need to take place. And then you start realizing, and because I grew up in the white evangelical church, like that white evangelical machine it's a monster. It's a behemoth, or it's just a monster. Let's just call it that, because like
whatever the word is, right?
Whatever the word is. I have a great word in mind, Keith, and then my tongue doesn't want to say it. So,
it doesn't get any easier the older you get. So,
yeah, I'm sure you never run into that as a podcast host.
Never.
Never. We never stumble over our words.
We edit that part out so we look so smooth.
Exactly. Because so much of our church is just about passivity, right? We go, we sit, maybe we engage in worship, but I'm not even sure, like, how, sometimes I wonder about worship too. But like, we then sit and receive and hear a sermon. And so like when that is our model of what the Christian life looks like, we just don't even think through what it means to then sit, um, you know, because then communion's an add-on. Or when I was growing up, we celebrated communion maybe once a month in an evening service and once a quarter. Like communion's never factored into the centrality of the white evangelical church. I think it's maybe changing a little, but um, or if it's done with stale crackers and really bad grape juice. Like that's not what I want. That's not Jesus's kingdom to me. Like, come on, like, can we? I've always thought, like, I long for the day when I walk up to church and smell fresh baked bread, like, that's going to be used for communion. Like, um, and part of that is, my mom baked fresh bread all growing up, and so there were days I'd come home from school and the house is just awash with fresh baked bread, and we would beg her for a slice of warm bread, because there's nothing better, in my opinion. Um, and so I think, how do we build a more inclusive table is, part of me thinks like there's stuff that just needs to die. And I don't know how that's going to happen or when that's going to happen. Um, but as we sort of decentralize church and make it more where we are talking, where we value the home more than a building, and value our neighbors more than getting them to a building. Um, but I think it's just doing it in our own homes. And so maybe we just start, and maybe I just start with my family, and we just make sure we're eating together. Um, and then realizing that as we go, as guests into the world, like, there's a phrase I heard I was at theology beer camp this year and went to a seminar, and they were talking about Jesus as a you contaminant, like EU, like being a good contaminant. And that, like, do we believe that Jesus's presence in my life is for the good of everybody else around me, and that power can transform the world, that I don't need to be scared of one bad apple ruining the bunch, but rather Jesus's presence is like, he is a good apple, and a bunch of spoiled apples can transform the bad apples. Whereas we always want to recede into the background or shelter in place, or and I think it's becoming even more so today. But like, do we still believe that Jesus can be a good contaminant for the world? And that takes a lot of work, right? Because we still need boundaries. There are still people out there who are spewing hatred in the name of Jesus. um, and so I'm not saying, invite those people into your home tomorrow. uh, like, uh, don't hurt yourself, don't hurt your family, like, um, but can you do the internal work too of being present and rooted in Christ's love to such the degree that you can begin to have touchy conversations, and not get triggered, but be a loving presence to people who, when their world breaks down, they'll look to you and be like, hey, Keith, Andrew was a good presence. He never shamed me. He never ridiculed me. Maybe I can ask him something about Jesus.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. And I think that's hard because the conversations today are difficult to have. We're not used to
Yeah.
having them.
No.
And so we retreat from conversation. We retreat from fellowship. So yeah, it's how do we get back to that? Let's sit down, let's break bread, let's talk. I just miss the conversation. A lot of times on my podcast, I have people who I don't necessarily agree with, but I enjoy the conversation because you can have a respectful conversation with people, and you've learned some things. I haven't necessarily changed my opinion, but I've like, there's a wider perspective here than if I just have this narrow view of this is the way the world is, and ignore the other side. And so I love my cell phone. My phone has news from different sides of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Which totally confuses my Apple phone. It's like, I don't know what to send you. You got far right stuff, you got far left stuff, you got moderate stuff. So my phone just goes, here, just take this.
Take this. Yeah.
But I want to get the story from multiple perspectives. And I've had guests on my podcast, and we talked about, like, for example, what's happening in Israel.
Mm.
I've had Muslims on tell me about the perspective of that. I've had people who were Jewish on. I'm like, I want to know the real story. It's not what other people are telling me. There's so much more here. There's a history here that we often don't get. So I appreciate
Yeah.
having the breaking of the bread table conversation where we can go deeper.
Right. And I think I love what you just said about, you're having the diversity um, of people. Because when you attach a human face to a story, like it's harder to hate, it seems. Where, oh, wait, no, people are affected by this. Like there's a real story, there's a real human. um, you know, Even for people who we would really, really strongly disagree with, like, oh wait, there's a reason, there's something that's led them to this path. And if I can begin to understand them as a person instead of just ideas, I think there's something really profound
Right.
that can happen. And yeah, and as you sent me questions, you mentioned, the telling of stories. That stories connect, and that's what I would hope that's what happens at a table is the stories.
Right. So, Andrew, this is my second favorite question to ask my guests. As you think about all the things that you're doing and the direction God has taken you, when this is all said and done, when you've made your last podcast, what do you want your legacy to be?
That is a really good question. The thing that jumps out, and I want to be faithful, that people say, oh, he was faithful with God, what God called him to do and what God equipped him to do, and that he loved well, that I love my family well, um, that I love my community well, and I need to do better. There's room for growth. Maybe that's the better way to say it. That like I can't change capitalism. I can't change the big, systems, but I can impact people. And so I'm thinking that through. I don't know. I'd be curious your response too. But Claire, my wife, asked me recently. She's like, "Hey, how do you want to live differently because of all the conversations you're having? Like, you're having these rich conversations, and how does it move beyond an intellectual fun conversation to actually impacting how I live?" Because I don't know about you, you get these conversations and they're fun ideas, but how to actually then implement something can be challenging. And so, yeah, I think it's that I was willing to hear the truth and then maybe change some of how I lived so that I could live more congruent with what I say on this podcast.
Yeah, for me, how that's changed the way I interact is I always say there's more to the story. Kind of like the Paul Harvey thing. It's like there's a rest of the story. This is not the entire story. And for me, when I look at situations or I look at an event and go, there's another side to this. And so I don't want to just accept the first narrative that I hear, or the first set of stories that I hear, but I want to go deeper and find out what's behind it. What caused this to happen? What led to this? Are there other circumstances around this that I may not be aware of? So I don't just accept the first narrative. So, with major events in our history, in our country, I go, well, okay, there's, for example, January 6th. There's a January 6th narrative. There's an actual January 6th story. I want to know the January 6th story, not just the narrative that people are telling me. There are other factors involved. So I don't take the initial first step as, oh, this is true. But there's more to happen that day. And I reserve judgment until I get the entire story.
Right. Now I hear that. Yeah. 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 I think my struggle with that is, I love all the information before, I need to know everything before I do something. And so I get paralysis by, information. And so how do I still make steps? Like it doesn't need to be major changes, but like what's the next little step I need to take to live more congruent with what I feel is right. And so, yeah.
Yeah. So what I do is I always tell people I reserve the right to change my mind.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
As more information becomes available, I deserve the right to change my mind.
Yeah. No, I think that's a humble way to do it. Yeah. That we don't know everything, that we're something may come up that should change my mind, and can I be open to that?
Right. So, Andrew, where can people find your podcast, The Biggest Table?
I'm wherever you find your podcast. Yeah, I'm on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I have a personal website that is still in the works, but it's out there. Again, I need to not wait for it to be perfect. I just need to get something out there at times. So andrewdavidcamp.com. You can find some information about me. But yeah, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you find your podcasts, The Biggest Table. I got some cool guests. I have some Black food scholars for Black History Month, just to talk about soul food and what's all wrapped up in that. And so super excited about February and March really excited about how the podcast continues to take shape.
Well, Andrew, thanks so much for taking the time to be on my podcast and sharing a little bit of your heart and what God's doing through you.
I appreciate it, Keith. Thanks for having me. It's always fun.
Yeah. Blessings, my friend.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Becoming Bridge Builder. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the podcast, please subscribe and share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram @bkeithhaney and on Getter and Twitter @RevHeadpin. Thanks again, and tune in next time.